A secret buried for decades, a will that could destroy lives, and Holmes racing against time. Welcome to Bold Blasters, I'm Pendleton. Your thoughts make this case even sharper. Comment where you're watching from. Let's unravel the mystery together. It was in the early spring of 18 that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street, the scent of damp fog curling in through the slightly ajar window, mingling with the heady aromas of Turkish tobacco and yesterday's chemical experiments. Outside, London loomed grey and muffled, but within our little sanctuary the world was poised perpetually on the brink of revelation. Holmes was lounging, as was his wont when bereft of challenging occupation, in the armchair that fit him like a second skin. A Persian slipper of tobacco hung from the mantel, and the Times lay discarded at his feet. His fingers drummed the arms of the chair in restless percussion, and his gaze had taken on that peculiar abstraction I had come to know as the lull before the hunt. It was I who broke the silence, though not without reluctance. "You've not stirred all morning, Holmes. Surely even you cannot subsist on sheer introspection." He smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Watson, I have already solved 2 puzzles since breakfast. The first was why Mrs. Hudson replaced our usual marmalade with apricot jam, a minor deduction involving a delivery man's scuffed boot, and the faint odour of turpentine." I blinked. "And the second?" Holmes's eyes twinkled. "You received a letter this morning bearing the seal of Lincoln's Inn. Your legal acquaintance, Mr. Emery, has no doubt written to enlist your opinion, or perhaps mine, on a most intriguing affair. You left the envelope tucked into your second-best medical journal, likely intending to read it once you finished your tea." Startled, I glanced at the volume in question. Sure enough, the unopened letter peered out from between its pages like an impatient child. I retrieved it and offered Holmes a rueful glance. "You astound me." He gave a small shrug. "The dust on the envelope matches that of the floor near the umbrella stand, indicating you dropped it and retrieved it hastily. The seal is that of Lincoln's Inn, and your social calendar has been light this week save for Emery's dinner invitation, which you declined. I merely connected the dots." I slit open the envelope with a silver letter opener and read quickly, my brow furrowing. When I finished, I handed it to Holmes in silence. He took it with idle fingers and read aloud in a clipped voice. "My dear Dr. Watson, I apologize for the urgency, but a most singular matter has arisen involving the recent and sudden death of Sir Benedict Wareham, the antiquarian and legal scholar of some repute. While the coroner's inquest declared the death natural, heart failure to be precise, I have been retained by the family to handle the estate, and I am deeply troubled by certain irregularities in the late Sir Benedict's testament. There appears to be a second will, older perhaps, yet not properly revoked, and it has vanished under curious circumstances. Most troubling of all is the claim by Sir Benedict's ward, Miss Lillian Wareham, that he spoke to her on the eve of his death about destroying the past before it destroys the present. I believe there is more here than meets the eye. If you and Mr. Holmes are willing, I would value your discretion and genius in examining the affair. Yours, in haste and sincerity, Albert Emery." Holmes's eyes were bright now, alive with that unmistakable gleam that presaged action. He tapped the letter thoughtfully. "Sir Benedict Wareham," he murmured. "A curious mind. I read his treatise on the Roman codexes, dense but insightful. To hear that he died with a mystery on his lips and that a document has gone missing. Yes, Watson, I believe our breakfast may yet be earned." I rose. "You mean to take the case?" He stood and fetched his coat. "It's foggy, Watson, There is mystery in the air, and where there is a missing testament, there is bound to be a conspiracy, or at least the shadow of one. Come, we shall call on Mr. Emery post-haste. An hour later. Chambers of Albert Emery, Lincoln's Inn. The chambers of Mr. Albert Emery were neat to the point of obsession, with law books bound in solemn leather, arranged alphabetically, their spines gleaming in the grey afternoon light. The man himself was a slight, angular fellow with a carefully trimmed moustache and an expression that flickered between anxiety and embarrassment. "I'm deeply grateful for your swift arrival, gentlemen," he said, gesturing for us to sit. "This matter, it disturbs me more than I can convey." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Emery. You say Sir Benedict died of heart failure?" "Yes. Found in his study by the housekeeper 2 mornings ago, slumped over his writing desk. No sign of violence. Dr. Armbruster signed the death certificate promptly." "But," Emery cleared his throat, "Sir Benedict was troubled in his final days. He had grown obsessed with a certain manuscript. He referred to it only obliquely as the Testament, and mentioned its rediscovery would ruin more than reputations. Then only days before his death he summoned me and insisted we destroy his existing will. He said another would replace it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And did he draft a new one?" "Possibly. That's the mystery. I never received it. And now, curiously, even the original will has disappeared." Watson frowned. "You suspect foul play?" Emery hesitated. "I suspect something, Dr. Watson. The safe in his study had not been forced, but both wills, assuming there were 2, are gone. And last night, someone broke into Sir Benedict's private library." Holmes leaned forward slightly.
"Nothing taken?" "No, but several volumes were displaced, and a fragment of parchment, ancient brittle, was found torn and crumpled by the hearth, as though someone had burned it in haste." Holmes's expression turned stony. "A disappearance, a death, and now arson. Mr. Emery, you are right to be alarmed." "And the household?" Holmes asked. "Who remains?" "His ward, Miss Lillian Wareham, bright, well-read, fiercely loyal to her guardian. A Mr. Jasper Linnet, a former student of Sir Benedict's, now his personal secretary. The housekeeper, Mrs. Garrow, and the butler, Travers. That is all." Watson asked, "What do you believe this testament referred to?" "I assumed it to mean a will, but Miss Wareham insists he meant something more, something historical. She swears he muttered something about restoring a forgotten truth and those who would kill to keep it hidden." Holmes stood abruptly. "Mr. Emery, I believe we must pay a visit to Wareham House at once. Watson, the game is afoot." Holmes was already striding briskly across the cobbled courtyard of Lincoln's Inn by the time I emerged behind him, his coat flaring like the tail of some great dark bird, his walking stick tapping with impatient rhythm. He hailed a hansom without turning, and I barely caught the address, Wareham House, Belgravia, before he climbed in and tapped twice on the roof. I settled beside him, my journal tucked under my arm, and studied his profile in the dim interior. The sharp line of his jaw, the distant glint in his eyes, these were familiar signs. He was threading together strands of logic, unseen to me, but already forming a pattern in that extraordinary mind. "You're quiet, Holmes," I said. "Too quiet." He glanced at me. "I'm reflecting, Watson. Already we have the faint outline of a pattern. It is my task to distinguish it from mere coincidence." "Do you truly believe Sir Benedict's death was not natural?" "I believe it was convenient," Holmes replied. "Far too convenient. An elderly scholar preparing to replace a will, perhaps with one naming a new heir, or containing some damning revelation, dies before he can do so, and the relevant documents vanish. Now someone breaks into his library to destroy a piece of ancient parchment. No, Watson, this is no simple matter of inheritance. We rode the remainder of the way in thoughtful silence, the fog thickening around us like muslin drawn across a lantern. Wareham House emerged at last through the mist, an imposing Georgian edifice, its brick facade darkened by time and soot. It had the brooding character of a place more accustomed to silence than mirth. A liveried butler, presumably Trevor's, received us with sombre efficiency and led us through panelled halls into a drawing-room still shrouded in mourning crape. A fire burned low in the grate, and beside it stood a young woman dressed in deep violet, her figure slender and
straight, her expression composed yet tinged with fatigue. "You are Mr. Holmes?" she asked quietly. "I am," Holmes replied with a short bow. "And this is Dr. Watson. You must be Miss Lillian Wareham." She nodded. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Emery said he would contact you. I confess I was half afraid you would decline." "I rarely decline a challenge, Miss Wareham," Holmes said gently. "And this case? Your guardian's death, the vanishing testament, the break-in, offers many." She motioned to the seats. "Please, I will tell you all I know." We seated ourselves, and Miss Wareham folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pale. "Sir Benedict raised me from childhood," she began. "He was a difficult man at times, proud, secretive, but never unkind. In his final weeks he became unsettled, distracted. He often locked himself in his library for hours, muttering about a document he had uncovered, something he believed could rewrite accepted history. He wouldn't tell me what it was, only that it was dangerous." "Did he say where he found this document?" Holmes asked. "He said it was among a collection sent from the estate of a recently deceased antiquarian, a man named Hugh Cranley. They were associates, I believe." Holmes gave a slight nod. "I recall the name. Cranley had a reputation for acquiring artifacts of questionable provenance." Lillian continued. "Sir Benedict seemed frightened by what he had found. He told me he had written a new will, but when I asked to see it, he laughed, nervously, not with his usual mirth. Then he said, 'Some truths must be hidden in plain sight, Lillian. That way only those with eyes can find them.' I thought he was speaking metaphorically." "Perhaps not," Holmes murmured. "And the night he died?" "I found him that morning. Well, Mrs. Garrow did. But the night before I heard voices in the study. I assumed he was speaking to Mr. Lynette, his secretary, but Mr. Lynette insists he retired early." "Suspicious," Holmes muttered. "Who else had access to the study?" "Only those of us in the household. Myself, Mr. Lynette, Travers, and Mrs. Garrow. But the study was always locked at night. Sir Benedict kept the key on his person." Holmes rose and paced. "Tell me about the library. The night it was broken into, what exactly occurred?" "I was asleep, but Travers said he heard a sound downstairs around 2 a.m. When he investigated, he found the door to the library ajar and the fire still glowing, though it had been banked earlier. Several books were displaced, and on the hearth he found what looked like burned parchment. He brought me what was left. I kept the fragment." She rose and crossed the room to a small cabinet. From within, she withdrew a square of charred vellum, barely larger than my palm, and handed it reverently to Holmes. He turned it gently in the light. A few lines of Latin were still visible in an angular, archaic hand. His eyes narrowed. "Curious. This script is late Carolingian, 9th century perhaps, but what little I can read, regnum veritas testatio, suggests it was not ecclesiastical, possibly a political document." Watson, imagine if someone uncovered a lost confession of a monarch or a suppressed treaty. I looked at him. You think that's what Sir Benedict found? I think someone feared what he found and feared what he might do with it. Holmes turned to Miss Wareham. I must see his study. Now, if you please. We were led down a darkened corridor to a small, richly appointed room overlooking the garden. The desk, polished walnut, stood near a curtained window. Holmes made a slow circuit, examining bookshelves, floorboards, the legs of furniture. There was a safe, he asked. Yes, built into the floor beneath the desk. It's still locked. Holmes knelt, examined the panelling, then extracted a small tool from his coat. With delicate precision, he manipulated the hidden catch, and the safe creaked open. Inside was nothing. A square of dust outlined where papers had once been. He stood. Watson, you remember Emery said the safe was unopened. Yet this dust outline suggests the documents were removed no more than a day or two before the death. Then Sir Benedict himself removed them? Or someone with access, someone who made it appear untouched? Miss Wareham, who knew about this safe? Only Mr. Lynette and myself. And perhaps Mrs. Garrow, though I doubt she ever used it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then Mr. Lynette bears a closer look. The door creaked then, and a tall, pale man with thinning hair and spectacles entered, without knocking. His voice was clipped, his expression tight. I was told we had visitors. You must be Sherlock Holmes, Jasper Lynette. Holmes turned slowly. Indeed, and you, sir, are the secretary who was not in the study, yet was heard speaking to Sir Benedict the night he died. Lynette stiffened. I was in my rooms. If someone heard voices, they were mistaken. Holmes's gaze bore into him. Perhaps. But you will understand if I wish to examine your room and your correspondence. Lynette looked as though he might protest, but Miss Wareham stepped forward. Mr. Lynette, if you have nothing to hide. He inclined his head stiffly. Very well. As he turned to lead us out, Holmes whispered to me, He is lying, Watson, that much is plain, but the reason we shall soon uncover. And with that, we followed the reluctant Mr. Lynette toward the servants' wing of the house, the mystery deepening like the fog outside. Mr. Jasper Lynette's chambers were tucked away in the northern wing of Wareham House, far removed from the grand parlours and marbled halls that bore the weight of aristocratic generations. The servants' wing was narrower, colder, the wallpaper curling faintly at the edges. Holmes walked slightly ahead of our reluctant host, his gaze darting along skirting boards and hinges with the silent hunger of a predator. Lynette's room, when he unlocked and pushed open the door, was meticulously kept. A narrow bed, a modest desk, and a pair of glass-fronted bookcases adorned the walls. A gas lamp hissed in the corner, casting a trembling light on neat piles of correspondence stacked beside a blotter. There, Lynette said with an edge of defiance. As you can see, Mr. Holmes, nothing here is amiss. Holmes, without replying, moved to the writing desk. He examined the surface, the inkwell, and the blotter with intense scrutiny. With gloved fingers, he lifted the corner of the blotter and held it to the light. Then, producing a small mirror from his inner coat pocket, he angled it beneath the blotting paper and read silently for a moment. Watson and I watched in silence. Curious, Holmes murmured. You've been corresponding with a certain Mr. C. Norwood of Oxford, I see. Lynette stiffened. A colleague. We exchanged scholarly opinions on the Wareham Latin manuscripts. Yet your letter references a purchase and a deadline. That is a private matter, Lynette said, his voice clipped. Holmes turned to him. So private that you concealed it even from Miss Wareham and Mr. Emery? It suggests more than scholarly inquiry, Mr. Lynette. Lynette's expression soured. If you mean to accuse me of impropriety, Mr. Holmes, I should warn you that I am under no legal obligation to entertain these baseless— Tut, Holmes interrupted, lifting a small scrap of paper from beneath the desk. What is this, then? The fragment bore a wax seal half-scorched, its design no longer visible, but the texture and shape of the seal suggested it had once bound a scroll or ribboned folio. Holmes pocketed it calmly. Lynette made a move as if to object, then faltered under Holmes's gaze. I don't suppose you'd object to Dr. Watson examining your wastebasket? Lynette did not respond. I crossed to the corner and sifted through its contents carefully. At first, only discarded blotter sheets and broken pencils met my eye, but at the bottom, crumpled tightly, was a half-burned envelope. The edge bore the inked initials B.W., Sir Benedict's hand, unmistakably. Holmes took it from me, inspecting it in silence. Then he turned to Lynette once more. You were hiding correspondence from Sir Benedict? You were exchanging letters with an antiquities dealer in Oxford, and you failed to disclose that Sir Benedict entrusted you, days before his death, with a sealed envelope. What did it contain, Mr. Lynette? I don't know, Lynette said, now pale. He left it in my desk drawer and told me not to open it until after his death. You opened it, Holmes said flatly, and you burned it. And now the will is gone, the manuscript fragment destroyed, and the only man who understood its full significance lies in a grave. Lynette opened his mouth, then closed it. Holmes turned to me. Watson, note that Mr. Lynette did not deny destroying the envelope, merely claimed ignorance as to its contents, which suggests he feared its implications. I had no wish to harm Sir Benedict, Lynette said suddenly, almost pleading. He was like a father to me, but he had grown unstable, obsessed with secrets. He believed that manuscript proved the Plantagenets falsified the records of a royal marriage, that it would undo centuries of accepted English succession. Holmes's eyes flashed, and such a revelation, if true, would unsettle more than a few noble titles. Perhaps that is why someone, perhaps even you, decided it could not come to light. No, Lynette exclaimed. I only feared for his reputation. He was speaking nonsense, seeing shadows. I thought if I could retrieve the document, show it to a real expert, someone who might discredit it, then he would come to his senses. Yet he died before you had the chance, Holmes murmured. Or perhaps he was silenced before he could speak further. At this, Lynette sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his hands trembling in his lap. I don't know who broke into the library, he said hoarsely, but I know Sir Benedict had enemies, quiet ones, in the museum, in the inner temple, even in Parliament. He corresponded with men far more powerful than I could ever dream to be. Holmes narrowed his eyes. And what of the man in Oxford, C. Norwood? What was the nature of your exchange? Lynette swallowed. He was offering money for the document, not the will, the other one. He claimed to represent a private collection, anonymous patrons. He said they would pay any sum to acquire it, but I didn't respond. Except to negotiate a deadline, Holmes said. Lynette looked away. Holmes exhaled. You're fortunate, Mr. Lynette, that greed alone is not a crime. We departed shortly afterward, Holmes deep in thought as we exited into the fog-blanketed street. I followed him without speaking until he finally broke the silence. There is more to this than a frightened secretary's ambition, he said. Lynette may be vain, even weak, but he is not the architect of this conspiracy. No? I asked. He seemed capable enough of deceit. Indeed. But someone else has the other half of this puzzle, someone who stood to gain not merely from silencing Sir Benedict, but from ensuring the lost testament and manuscript never reached daylight. Then you believe Miss Wareham is in danger? Holmes nodded slowly. She may be the last person alive who knows what Sir Benedict intended to do with the manuscript. And if he told her even part of it— He paused, turning to look behind us. Let us walk a little farther, Watson. I wish to consider what Lynette didn't say. You believe he withheld something more? Certainly. Why destroy a letter but leave its envelope? Why speak of restoring Sir Benedict's reputation when he feared the truth? We reached a street lamp, and Holmes paused beneath it, retrieving the charred scrap of parchment from his pocket once again. Testatio, regnum, veritas, a testimony to truth regarding the throne, Watson. This was no idle treatise. Do you believe Sir Benedict uncovered a legitimate claim? Holmes tucked the scrap away. Perhaps. Or perhaps he uncovered the illusion of one, a forgery so well crafted it could not be disproven without destroying reputations. He glanced upward at the gaslight's glow, and his voice dropped. Watson, tomorrow we must visit Cranley's estate. If this manuscript came from among his papers, there may be a trail yet to follow. But Cranley is dead. Holmes smiled grimly. Yes, but the dead are notoriously careless with their secrets, and I intend to dig up every last one. The following morning broke damp and reluctant, the sky the colour of soot, and the pavements slick with last night's drizzle. Holmes, impervious as ever to weather or discomfort, was already lacing his boots with military precision when I descended into the sitting-room, rubbing sleep from my eyes and nursing a tepid cup of tea. He had summoned a carriage before I had even touched my toast. We must reach Hampshire before noon, he said briskly. Cranley's estate lies near the village of Romsey. If Sir Benedict truly acquired the manuscript from among Cranley's effects, we may find evidence to confirm it, perhaps even a trail to its origin. I thought the Cranley papers were sold to collectors, I said, pulling on my coat. Surely nothing remains. Collectors, Holmes muttered, are only as thorough as their appetites, and the executors of a private estate, particularly one with a labyrinthine library and eccentric cataloguing, often miss what lies beneath their noses. We set out shortly thereafter, and the journey was long and jostling. Fields rolled by in indistinct greys, sheep huddled beneath trees, and the countryside was blanketed in a silence that seemed altogether deeper than London's constant murmur. Holmes spoke little during the ride, occasionally tapping his fingers against his leg or consulting a list of names he had jotted in pencil. Who are they? I asked. Scholars and antiquarians known to have dealings with both Cranley and Wareham, a cross-reference of correspondence, as it were. One or two names may become relevant, depending on what we find. The carriage turned off the main road and climbed a narrow lane lined with low stone walls and scrub oaks. At its crest loomed Stonebrook Hall, Cranley's estate, a grand but weary house of Elizabethan design, with crow-stepped gables and windows that squinted like tired eyes. A peacock called somewhere behind the hedges, its cry wild and incongruous. We were received by a Mr. Harold Petley, a nervous executor and distant cousin of the late Cranley, who had remained at Stonebrook to assist in cataloguing the lingering volumes that no collector had claimed. "A terrible business, Mr. Holmes," Petley said, wringing his hands as he led us into a draughty drawing-room stacked high with books in varying degrees of disrepair. We tried to keep the estate's scholarly holdings intact, but you know how buyers are, always circling like birds. Still, there are several dozen crates yet unsorted in the east wing. Old Cranley had a habit of hiding things between unrelated folios, once found a deed stuffed inside a commentary on Ovid's Amores. Holmes showed the faintest glimmer of satisfaction. Precisely the sort of disorder I was hoping for. And Sir Benedict Wareham he visited shortly before Cranley's death? Several times, Petley confirmed. They corresponded for years, but in those final months Wareham came in person, always left with a wrapped parcel or two, once, I believe, with a folio so large he could barely carry it. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Where are the unsorted crates? Petley led us through a maze of corridors and galleries until we reached a long, dim chamber that smelled of parchment and cold plaster. Crates lined one wall, each filled with tightly packed volumes, many without titles, some still wrapped in tissue. Holmes wasted no time. He removed his gloves, rolled up his sleeves, and dove into the nearest crate. I joined him, though my search was less directed, and the minutes passed in an absorbing silence, broken only by the rustle of old paper and the occasional sneeze as the dust rose around us. It was nearly an hour before Holmes made a sound, a low hum of satisfaction. He had opened a narrow folio bound in flaking red leather and was examining the paste down inside the front cover. He beckoned me over. "Note this inscription, Watson. Bibliotheca C. Norwoodensis, 1862. The same Norwood who offered Lynette money. This volume once belonged to him. Somehow it ended up in Cranley's library. Perhaps Cranley purchased it? Or perhaps it was placed here deliberately. Note the page numbers out of sequence. Someone removed a section, perhaps even substituted one." He turned several more pages before stopping at a curious gap. 2 folios missing, the stitching disrupted. He ran his fingers over the spine, then tilted the book. A faint trail of dark powder trickled out. "Dust from burnt vellum," Holmes said, matching the fragment recovered from Wareham House. "Watson, I believe this was the original housing for the manuscript Sir Benedict tried to preserve." A voice from the doorway startled us. "You won't find the rest of it." We turned. Standing there, half-shadowed, was a man of medium height, in travelling clothes damp from the rain, his collar turned up, and a narrow satchel at his side. He carried himself with the self-possession of a man who had seen both drawing-rooms and battlefields. Holmes straightened. "May I ask who you are, sir?" The man stepped forward. "Charles Norwood, I believe you've encountered my name." Petley blanched. "How did you get in? The gatekeeper—" "Was otherwise occupied," Norwood said dryly. "I've come for what remains, but I see you've already found it." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Mr. Norwood, perhaps you would enlighten us. What precisely did Sir Benedict find in this manuscript?" Norwood's smile was thin. "Something that should never have left my possession. A confession, or the semblance of one, from a Plantagenet bishop, a man who claimed a secret royal marriage and a lost heir. It was likely apocryphal, of course, but had enough names and dates to cause a stir. Wareham, in his obsession, mistook it for truth." "You offered money to suppress it," Holmes said. "I offered compensation for my property. Lynette was willing. Wareham was not." Holmes's tone sharpened. "And when Wareham refused, did you act to silence him?" Norwood's eyes narrowed. "If I had, do you think we would be having this conversation?" Holmes stepped forward. "Then let us speak plainly. The will is missing. The manuscript is destroyed. And Sir Benedict died under circumstances too convenient for chance. If not you, then who?" Norwood regarded him steadily. "There were others interested, Mr. Holmes. I represent one group, but others feared the exposure of even a forged manuscript. A noble family's position could collapse overnight if such a document were authenticated." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "And you believe one of those parties acted?" "I believe," Norwood said quietly, "that when power is threatened, murder is rarely off the table." With that, he turned and left, vanishing down the corridor before Petley could protest. I turned to Holmes, unsettled. "You believe him?" "I believe he told the truth as it suited him," Holmes said. "But he is not our killer. He is a broker, a fixer, perhaps even a thief, but not a man who strangles an old scholar in the dark." He gazed down at the empty folio, his expression unreadable. "The person we seek is someone who remained close to Sir Benedict, someone who knew what he had discovered, someone with the motive and the presence of mind to erase both a will and a piece of history." He snapped the book shut and replaced it carefully in the crate. "Come, Watson, we must return to London. The fog has not yet lifted, and our real adversary still hides within it." We arrived back in London just as the city's gaslights blinked to life in the growing dusk, illuminating the fog in hazy halos. Holmes was unusually silent during the ride from the station, leaning forward in the cab with his chin resting on the back of his gloved hand, eyes half-lidded, but far from sleepy. I knew better than to interrupt. When he was arranging facts, he liked solitude, not silence for its own sake, but the stillness needed to distinguish signal from noise. At last, as we turned onto Baker Street, he spoke, as if no time had passed since we left Stonebrook Hall. Norwood gave us the key. I blinked. I thought he was being evasive. He was, but in doing so he revealed something vital. He spoke of others with something to lose if the manuscript surfaced. That confirms it, Watson. Sir Benedict's death was no impulsive act. It was a preventative measure, calculated quiet. Someone feared that either the original testament or the content of the document would become public. So they erased both. I frowned. But who? Norwood may be slippery, but he didn't strike me as a killer. He's not, but think. Who else had access to the house, knowledge of Sir Benedict's discoveries, and an interest in suppressing them? He tapped his fingers sharply against the window. Lynette fits only some of those criteria. Miss Wareham, though loyal, was largely in the dark, which leaves the staff, I said slowly. Trevor's, or Mrs. Garrow. Holmes nodded. More specifically, Trevor's. I looked at him in surprise. The butler? He barely spoke? Precisely. He played the invisible man to perfection. Yet he was awake at 2 a.m. when the library was broken into. He claimed to have heard a noise. Curious, don't you think, that he arrived just in time to find the remnants of a fire and a destroyed fragment? But wouldn't that make him the person who discovered the crime? Or staged it? Consider this. He's the one who reported the break-in, and he alone had access to the servant passages near the library. We arrived at Baker Street and made for the sitting room. Holmes wasted no time. He moved to his desk and retrieved a small folder from the stack of correspondence. "This arrived the day we left for Hampshire," he said, opening it. "A report I requested from a trusted contact at the Foreign Office. He handed it to me. It was a background file on Philip Trevor's. I scanned the page. Served in British consular offices on the continent, fluent in French and Latin, dismissed from service in 1887 under unclear circumstances, reappeared in London 2 years later under the name Philip Trevor's, employed by Sir Benedict Wareham." I stared at Holmes. "You think this man was planted?" "I think he reinvented himself at the precise moment Sir Benedict was growing obsessed with historical secrets. That's no coincidence. A man trained in languages and diplomacy suddenly becoming a butler in a scholar's household. Not a typical career move, wouldn't you say?" Holmes moved to the window and looked out at the fog rolling in from the north. "No, Watson, Trevor's is no mere servant. He was watching Sir Benedict, perhaps reporting on him, possibly even acting as an agent for those unnamed others Norwood so delicately referenced." I stood, alarmed. "And if he suspects we're onto him?" Then we must force his hand. We pay another visit to Wareham House tonight. The fog in Belgravia lay thick as wool, coiling around wrought iron fences and blurring the edges of the lamps. Wareham House loomed behind its gates like a silhouette drawn in smoke. Miss Wareham greeted us at the door, startled to see us again so soon. "Miss Wareham," Holmes said gravely, "for your safety and ours, I must ask you to remain in your room for the next hour. Please tell no one we've arrived, not even the staff." She hesitated, but obeyed, her eyes searching Holmes's face for an explanation. He gave her none. Once she was gone, Holmes turned to me. "We wait." We positioned ourselves in the narrow gallery overlooking the back of the house, concealed by thick velvet drapes. Holmes had deduced that the library would be visited again if the person we suspected had not yet finished cleaning up traces of their crime. An hour passed in silence. Then, from the corridor below, came a faint creak. A moment later, the unmistakable silhouette of Trevor's passed through the moonlit hall. He moved slowly but with purpose, glancing over his shoulder once, before slipping into the library and closing the door behind him. Holmes tapped my shoulder and we moved, soundless as smoke. The door to the library was slightly ajar. Holmes pushed it gently with the tip of his cane. Inside, Trevor's was kneeling by the hearth, lifting the iron grate. Beside him on the floor was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes stepped inside. "Looking for something, Trevor's?" The butler froze. He turned slowly, expression blank. "Mr. Holmes, I did not hear you enter." "Nor did you expect to see me," Holmes said. "Tell me, what is that bundle?" "A parcel," Travers said quietly. "Personal papers. They belong to Sir Benedict." "Which you intended to burn," Holmes said, "as you did the first fragment." Travers didn't move. Holmes gestured to the oilcloth. "Put it down. We'll examine it together." Travers did so. Holmes stepped forward and unwrapped it. Inside were several aged papers, one of them unmistakably a draft of a will with Sir Benedict's seal. Holmes lifted it. "So, this is what you meant to destroy?" Travers straightened. "He had gone mad, sir. I tried to protect him from himself, from those who would misuse what he found." "You were sent here, Travers," Holmes said, "to monitor Sir Benedict, perhaps by a government agency or a family whose lineage he was close to unseating, but you grew fond of him." "I did," Travers said. "He was a good man, but he was poking at old bones best left buried. That manuscript, whether true or not, could have caused chaos. And he wouldn't let it go." "So you destroyed it?" "No," Travers said. "I burned what I found in the fire, but he had hidden a second copy. I only found it the night he died." Holmes went still. "So you were in the study?" "Yes. I was trying to reason with him. He refused. He shouted, clutched at his chest. He fell. I tried to help him, but he was already gone. I panicked. I removed the will. I burned the document. I made it look like a break-in to suggest a thief had taken it." There was silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. "I did not murder him, Mr. Holmes," Travers said softly, "but I did what I believed was necessary. I would do it again." Holmes regarded him with cold scrutiny. "That decision is not yours to make. You are not the arbiter of truth." He turned to me. "Watson, take these papers. We'll deliver them to Mr. Emery. Let the courts decide the weight of the testament." He faced Travers again. "You will not flee. Scotland Yard will arrive shortly." Travers bowed his head. "I will not run." And as we stepped back into the cool air of the corridor, Holmes whispered, "The case is not quite closed, Watson. There's still one more piece missing." I glanced at him. "The second copy?" Holmes shook his head. "No. The person who knew of the manuscript before Travers did, someone else was manipulating this from behind the curtain. and we've only just begun to see their shadow. We left Wareham House just after midnight, the air heavy with the tension of the confession we had extracted and the secret still lurking beneath it. The streets of Belgravia were hushed, save for the distant clip of hooves and the hiss of gas lamps. Holmes was deep in thought again, eyes glinting beneath the brim of his hat, his coat drawn close against the fog. Travers had confessed, yes, but Holmes was not satisfied. And after years at his side, I could recognize that peculiar twitch of dissatisfaction, that sense of something amiss gnawing at the edges of an otherwise completed puzzle. "Are you truly convinced Travers told us everything?" I asked, as we turned on to Grosvenor Place. "No," Holmes replied shortly. "He told us what suited his conscience, what he could live with. But there is one crucial gap in his account, a logical absence, as glaring as a missing brick in a wall." "What do you mean?" Holmes turned his gaze on me. "Travers claimed he found the second copy of the manuscript after Sir Benedict's death, that he destroyed it to prevent chaos. But for that to be true, Watson, we must believe that Sir Benedict prepared a new will, preserved a secondary copy of the manuscript, and hid both, while under surveillance with a weakening heart and no knowledge of when the final moment would come." I frowned. "And you don't find that plausible?" "Hardly. No man facing death behaves so inconsistently. If he feared the document falling into the wrong hands, he would have destroyed it. If he believed it needed protection, he would have sent it to someone he trusted, perhaps even Miss Wareham. And yet, he did neither." "Which leads me to believe," Holmes said slowly, "that the second copy, if it exists, is not yet found. Travers destroyed something, yes, but I suspect it was a decoy." I fell silent for a moment. "Then the real copy is still hidden?" "Precisely, and only one person might know where it is." "You mean Miss Wareham?" Holmes shook his head. "No, she has been consistently forthright, her surprise and confusion genuine. No, Watson, there is another." He drew a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. It was the list of correspondence Holmes had mentioned earlier, those who had exchanged letters with both Cranley and Sir Benedict. I ran my eyes down the names. Several were of no consequence to me, but one stopped me cold. "Reverend Dr. Lionel Allerton," I read aloud, "ecclesiastical scholar, and expert in Latin paleography." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. I made inquiries while you slept on the train. Reverend Allerton visited Sir Benedict several times in the past year, under the pretext of theological discussions. But curiously, Allerton's sermons in his parish have recently touched on obscure, early Plantagenet controversies, topics no ordinary country cleric would bother with." "You think he saw the manuscript?" "I think he helped interpret it," Holmes said. "And if Sir Benedict was reluctant to act on it, Allerton might not have been." We hailed a cab and made our way across town to Clerkenwell, where Allerton resided in a modest vicarage beside St. Dunstan's chapel. The church loomed behind the parsonage like a slumbering watchman, and the narrow alley behind it shimmered faintly with mist. Holmes knocked firmly. It was nearly 1 in the morning. After a long pause, a light came on above. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a thin man with greying hair and night robes appeared, lantern in hand and expression wary. "May I help you, gentlemen?" "Reverend Dr. Allerton," Holmes said, "we regret the hour, but our business is urgent. It concerns the late Sir Benedict Wareham." Allerton stiffened. "I've heard of his passing. A great loss." "You corresponded with him?" Holmes continued. "On matters of medieval church history, perhaps also on royal genealogy?" The man hesitated. "Yes, occasionally." Holmes stepped forward. "You saw the manuscript, didn't you? The one Sir Benedict recovered from Cranley's library?" "I don't." We've already spoken to Mr. Norwood and to Sir Benedict's secretary. We know the document existed, and we believe it was interpreted with your assistance." Allerton closed the door partway. "I don't think—" Holmes's tone sharpened. "Then let me be clear. Sir Benedict was murdered, or at the very least driven to death by the pressure surrounding this document. His will was suppressed, his study broken into, and his findings destroyed. And, unless I am very much mistaken, you know precisely where his true testament lies." Allerton looked away, the lantern light flickering across his face. "You don't understand," he said at last. "It was never meant for the public, not even for scholars. It was heretical, dangerous." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then it was real?" "All of it," Allerton said softly. "A confession from Bishop Reginald of Ely, circa 1286, testifying that a secret marriage had taken place, one that altered the line of succession. It names names, places, witnesses. Had Sir Benedict published it, entire noble houses would have been delegitimized." "Then you advised him to suppress it?" "Yes," Allerton said. "I begged him to burn it. He refused." Holmes stepped closer. "Did he entrust it to you?" Allerton looked up sharply. "No, he didn't trust me, but I believe he left it here, somewhere near this church." We stared at him in surprise. "I received a letter," Allerton continued, "2 days before his death, a single line, 'The truth shall sleep beneath the saint's forgotten hand.' I didn't understand it at the time." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "But I do. Watson, come." We left Allerton blinking in the doorway and made our way into the churchyard behind St. Dunstan's. Holmes moved quickly, scanning the names etched into old stone, brushing aside ivy and moss. Then he stopped. "Here," he said, tapping a half-cracked angel carved into a forgotten gravestone near the rear wall of the church. St. Dunstan was said to have cast out devils with tongs. His hand was once a relic, stolen in the 16th century. This, he touched the stone, was his supposed resting place. He knelt, pried at the earth. Within moments, his fingers found something beneath the soil, wrapped in oilcloth and pressed between 2 slates. We unwrapped it together. Inside was a leather-bound codex, fragile, faded, but unmistakably old. Holmes turned a page reverently, then another. Each was dense with Latin, marginal notes, and the occasional illumination. "The original," he breathed, "untouched." We took it back to Baker Street in silence, and Holmes placed it in his locked cabinet, beside the recovered will. He turned to me at last. "Now the puzzle is complete, Watson. Wareham's testament of history, a document that could have undone dynasties. He did not fear the truth, but those around him did. He left the truth buried, trusting that someday someone might bring it to light." I nodded, still awed. "What now?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "No, we let the historians argue, and we write our own record, not of kings, but of a forgotten scholar, murdered by caution and vindicated by curiosity." He poured 2 glasses of brandy and offered me one. "To the forgotten testament?" I said. Holmes raised his glass. "And to the man who would not let it die." We awoke the next morning to a London damp with drizzle and thick with tension. The revelations of the night before hung in the air like fog in a crypt. Holmes, uncharacteristically contemplative, stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, one hand in his dressing-gown pocket, and the other cradling a cup of black coffee which he had barely touched. He had slept little, if at all. When I rose just after dawn, I found him seated at the desk with the codex open before him, comparing Latin passages with notes jotted in his fine, angular script. He had already sent a telegram to Emery requesting his immediate presence. The will, recovered from Trevors's midnight machinations, lay under glass, untouched, since Holmes had locked it away. The room was silent, save for the occasional hiss of the fire. "I cannot help but wonder, Holmes," I said, settling into my chair, "whether we have uncovered justice or merely invited chaos in its place." Holmes did not turn. "That is the nature of truth, Watson. It does not offer comfort. It demands consequence." There was a knock at the door just then, and Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual cautious grace. "Mr. Emery is here, Mr. Holmes," she said. Holmes turned at once. "Show him in." Albert Emery entered, looking more drawn than usual, his coat glistening faintly with rain, his cravat slightly askew. He nodded at me, then turned immediately to Holmes. "You sent word you had recovered the will," he said, barely bothering to sit. "I came at once." Holmes gestured to the small cabinet. "There it lies, intact, as Sir Benedict wrote it." Emery opened the glass door and took up the document with trembling hands. He read the first few lines silently, then let out a slow, rattled breath. "Thank God, this confirms everything. Miss Wareham's inheritance, the revised bequests to several historical societies, and most importantly, the note in the codicil." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "You refer to the mention of a historical truth bound in parchment, not to be opened without due cause and scholarly guidance?" Emery nodded. "Sir Benedict's warning that the accompanying manuscript was not meant for public interpretation without context. He anticipated the danger of misreading it." "I suspected as much," Holmes said, "which is why I've secured it for now, and why I believe you, Mr. Emery, must make arrangements not just for the execution of the will, but for the controlled custody of the manuscript." "I've already reached out to the British Museum," Emery said. "A sealed archive, pending scholarly review. I imagine it will become the centre of debate for decades." Holmes gave a small nod. "Good. Let truth battle truth in the court of minds, but I warn you, keep it out of the newspapers. If the press catches wind, this story will become a weapon." Emery's eyes darkened. "It already is. There are men who would rather it never surfaced at all." When he departed a few minutes later, taking the will with him in a secure folio, Holmes resumed his seat and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "You were right last night," I said. "The manuscript was a decoy. Trevor's burned one, but the true testament was buried, quite literally. Because Sir Benedict knew someone in the house could not be trusted," Holmes said. "And he was right, but his great mistake was in waiting, in believing that the intellect of men would outweigh their ambition. And it cost him his life." Holmes nodded once. "Indeed." We had not long to contemplate further when a second visitor arrived, Miss Lilian Wareham, her expression taut, her gloves clenched tightly in one hand. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. "Mr. Emery sent word that the will had been found. Is it true?" "It is," Holmes replied. "And more besides. The inheritance is now yours, Miss Wareham, but that is not why you are here." She gave a sad smile. "You know me too well, Mr. Holmes. You were fond of your guardian. You seek the rest of the truth. About his death. About what he discovered. About who feared it." She sat slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "Yes." Holmes regarded her with quiet intensity. Sir Benedict's death was caused not by one man's hand, but by the pressure of many. Trevor's acted alone in destroying the fragment and concealing the will. But he was merely a tool, an agent. Others urged him on. "Do you know who?" "I have a strong suspicion," Holmes said. "But suspicions are not evidence. And unlike Trevor's, the others left no fingerprints. They acted through threat and persuasion, through whispers in dark places. Their names, if they appear at all, will be buried in footnotes, not court ledgers." "And you'll let them go?" Holmes did not flinch. "Yes." Miss Wareham's jaw tightened. "Then what was all this for?" Holmes rose and crossed to the cabinet. He opened it and took out the manuscript. He placed it gently on the desk before her. "For this," he said, "so that one man's truth would not be erased, so that history, even if buried again, would not be lost forever." She looked down at the leather cover, touched it with reverent fingers. "Will I be allowed to read it?" Holmes hesitated. "In time, when scholars have verified it, when tempers cool, when power has shifted enough that the truth is not feared." She rose. "I'll wait." At the door she turned back. "Do you believe it's true, that what Sir Benedict found actually happened?" Holmes looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I believe that every lie powerful enough to kill for is hiding a truth worth knowing." She nodded once, then left us in silence. That afternoon, Scotland Yard formally arrested Philip Trevors for obstruction of justice and destruction of a legal document. The Crown declined to pursue further charges, citing insufficient evidence of intent or direct causation in Sir Benedict's death. The world would never know the full extent of his role, but within our small circle, the matter was settled. The following week passed quietly. Holmes busied himself with a violin sonata he was transcribing and scarcely spoke of the case, save to inquire occasionally about Latin syntax. I wrote up the affair as I always did, omitting certain elements too volatile or delicate for public record. It would not see publication, Holmes had insisted, until long after we were both gone. On a grey Wednesday, as I sat reviewing my notes, Holmes looked up from the codex with a curious expression. "There's a phrase here, Watson. Latin, testamentum non est mortuum nisi de decoratum." I translated aloud. "A testament is not dead unless it is defiled." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Sir Benedict left us a document, but more than that, he left us a warning. That to conceal the truth out of fear is to betray it more deeply than by any lie." I nodded slowly. "It is fortunate, then," I said, "that he left it in the hands of someone who believed in truth." Holmes looked away then and for a long moment said nothing. And as the fog deepened around the windows of Baker Street once more, and the fire whispered in the grate, I understood why this case had affected him more than most. It was not merely about death or crime or the solving of a mystery. It was about memory, and the power of a single, forgotten testament to unearth not only the sins of the past, but the courage to face them. The days that followed unfolded with an air of uneasy quiet, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The case of Sir Benedict Wareham had been, in many respects, concluded, papers recovered, wills validated, confessions obtained. But as Sherlock Holmes and I moved through the final acts of the matter, I sensed, as I often did in his more introspective moods, that the true resolution was still forming in the private recesses of his mind. We were seated in the sitting room of Baker Street late one evening, the manuscript locked safely away once more, when Holmes at last stirred from his contemplative pose and fixed his gaze on me. "Watson," he said, "have you ever considered the anatomy of suppression?" I blinked. "Suppression?" "Yes." He rose and began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. A murder is often simple to comprehend: jealousy, money, revenge. But suppression, the deliberate burial of truth, is far more subtle. It requires planning, calculation, and above all, patience, the kind that spans not hours or days, but years, generations even. I nodded, still uncertain where he was heading. "What we uncovered," he continued, "was not just a lost manuscript. It was a lever, a fulcrum upon which the past and present momentarily balanced. Had it slipped into the wrong hands or been exposed without restraint, it could have been weaponized, fabricated into scandal, used not to educate, but to punish. And yet Sir Benedict trusted it to be found, I said. Eventually, precisely. Holmes stopped pacing. He did not trust people, Watson. He trusted time. He hid the truth in the one place that can neither lie nor flatter, the future. A silence fell between us, broken only by the gentle rustle of the fire. Holmes's features were drawn in sharper lines than usual, as if the weight of the case had pressed itself into his very bones. "You believe the matter is entirely at rest, then?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me. "No, not entirely. There remains one inconsistency, one door still ajar." I straightened. "What inconsistency?" Holmes crossed to the bureau and removed a small notebook from its drawer. He flipped it open and read aloud from a page he had written in his fine, spidery hand. "Wareham told me he had no plans to travel. He detested the country. Yet the day before his death a ticket was found on his person, Romsey to London return, unused." I frowned. Romsey, the town near Cranley's estate. Exactly. Why, Watson, would a man who claimed never to leave the city and who had already retrieved the document from Cranley's library possess a return ticket to Hampshire? A dated one, just 2 days before he died? My brow furrowed. "You believe he was planning to return, but why?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Because he was being watched. Travers kept close, but Wareham was a man of caution. I suspect he knew someone else, someone more dangerous, was also taking an interest. The manuscript, Watson, may have had a twin." My eyes widened. "A forgery?" "Not exactly. An alternative version. One not in Latin, but in Middle English, simplified, accessible, fabricated to seem genuine. I believe Sir Benedict may have learned of its existence and intended to retrieve or destroy it." I leaned forward. "But such a forgery, who would create it, and to what end?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That is the final question. I made inquiries this morning. The British Museum received an anonymous parcel 4 weeks ago, an unverified document purporting to contain genealogical confessions from the 13th century. It was dismissed as apocryphal, no provenance, no known scribe, but the timing is suspicious." He opened another drawer and withdrew a copy of the museum's catalogue record. I read it with growing disbelief. "The names are identical to those in Sir Benedict's manuscript, but the language, this is modernized, dramatized, practically written for public scandal." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Someone tried to get ahead of the truth. If this forgery had been accepted as genuine, then the real document, once discovered, would have seemed redundant, merely a more arcane version of the same tale. Worse, it would have discredited Sir Benedict entirely. They were preparing the ground for a public deception." "And you believe Sir Benedict found out?" "I do, and I believe that's what frightened him most. Not the power of truth, but the reach of a lie crafted to imitate it." The doorbell rang then, sharp and sudden, cutting through our quiet theorizing. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later, a letter in hand. "No sender," she said, placing it on the table before retreating with a frown. It came by hand. Holmes picked it up and turned it in his fingers, then slit it open with a flick of his pocket knife. He read it once, and then passed it to me without comment. The paper was thick and expensive. The message was brief. "Mr. Holmes, it is my sincere hope that your investigation into the matter of Sir Benedict Wareham is now concluded. Certain histories are best preserved under lock and key. You have done your part, and so have we. No further inquiries are necessary. A friend of the Crown." I read it again, then looked at Holmes. A threat? "No," he said calmly. "A warning, and perhaps a truce. We have come close to something they do not wish us to pursue further, but they're not foolish enough to challenge us outright. This letter is an ending of their choosing." I looked at him carefully. "And is it also yours?" Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into the fire. The flames devoured it in seconds. "No," he said quietly. "My ending came the moment I held the real testament in my hands. This," he waved vaguely toward the fireplace, "is merely the epilogue." I sat back in my chair. "Will you publish the account eventually?" "In time," he replied. "Heavily redacted. The world may read the story, Watson, but not the names, not yet. Perhaps in a generation, when the names no longer shake thrones." I reached for my pen and notebook, preparing to transcribe our final conclusions. Holmes returned to his violin, drawing the bow slowly across the strings, playing a mournful line that rose and fell with all the weight of unspoken truths. And as the sound filled the room, I thought again of Sir Benedict, of his long and solitary pursuit of forgotten truths, of a testament buried not just beneath stone and soil, but beneath fear, ambition, and silence. He had not lived to see his discovery vindicated, but through Holmes, through the quiet perseverance of reason and inquiry, his legacy had survived, not in headlines, not in scandal, but in the quiet pages of a locked cabinet, and in the memory of those who believed that the truth, however dangerous, was still worth uncovering. The final chapter of the Wareham affair, though never formally written into the annals of criminal prosecution or national scandal, lived on in the subtle ripples it sent through certain corridors of academia and whispered salons of London's upper echelons. Holmes, for his part, resumed his usual rhythm of life with outward nonchalance, alternating between chemical experiments and monographs on Byzantine cipher systems. But I had known him too long to mistake quiet for peace. The case still gnawed at him, not in the way an unsolved puzzle did, but more like an unfinished symphony where the final note had been struck, but the echo lingered unclaimed. One morning, some weeks after the conclusion of the case, I found Holmes seated at the window with a long folded sheet of foolscap on his knee. He was reading it with the same intensity he reserved for the agony columns or dispatches from the Royal Society. "A letter from Miss Wareham," he said without looking up. "Rather a thoughtful one." I took my seat across from him. "She's settling into her inheritance, I presume?" "She is, but her thoughts remain with Sir Benedict's manuscript. She has visited the museum, privately of course, where the document is kept in sealed custody. She writes that she feels more burdened than enriched by her new position, that she has inherited not just wealth, but obligation." "She's right," I said. "That kind of truth isn't something one owns, it's something one tends." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. She's already made arrangements for the manuscript to be submitted in time to an independent academic committee, unaffiliated scholars selected for neutrality." "A wise move?" He refolded the letter and tucked it into his drawer with quiet care. "Miss Wareham, I suspect, may yet do more for the world of historical integrity than many who profess scholarship from polished pulpits." As he stood to pour himself a cup of tea, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The story, as I had recorded it in my journals, far more fully than I would ever dare publish, was unlike any other case we had worked, not for lack of bodies or bullets or intrigue, but because the stakes had rested not in one man's guilt or innocence, but in the fate of truth itself. Holmes interrupted my reverie. "Tell me, Watson, do you recall the name I mentioned early in the case, Mr. Emery's fellow solicitor, who initially made mention of irregularities in the testament?" "Harold Eltham," I said after a moment's recollection. "Precisely, I paid him a visit 2 days ago." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "He was at first evasive, but when pressed, gently, he admitted something curious. He had 3 months before Sir Benedict's death received a sealed envelope from the scholar. It was marked, 'To be opened in the event of my death or discredit. I straightened in my chair. You never mentioned this. I wanted to confirm its authenticity before I considered its significance. Emery, it seems, was unaware. Eltham was instructed to keep it secret. Do you know what it contained? Holmes turned and opened a drawer, retrieving a small, sealed envelope. He held it up, but did not hand it over. I do. A third copy? I blinked. Another manuscript? No, Holmes said. A letter. In Sir Benedict's hand, addressed to the Prime Minister. That brought me to my feet. Holmes gestured for me to sit. Relax, Watson. It was never sent. Eltham was instructed to burn it after reading, but he did not. He lacked the nerve, or perhaps the resolve. He broke the wax seal and read aloud. To whom it may concern, the document which I have recovered and deciphered pertains to a lineage long thought closed and a truth long considered buried. I do not claim it as absolute, nor do I offer it as weapon or prophecy. I present it, instead, as evidence that history is a living thing, capable of shame and correction alike. I suspect I am being watched, perhaps by agents who believe suppression is salvation. Should I not survive, I urge that the manuscript be preserved, not sensationalized, but examined. To destroy the truth is to invite a darker lie in its place. I trust no institution with this charge. I trust instead the future, and those who walk its path with clear eyes. Yours in earnest duty, Sir Benedict Wareham. When Holmes finished, we sat in silence. The fire crackled low. Outside, rain pelted the window panes in fitful rhythms. So, I said at last, even in his final days he was thinking beyond his own safety. Holmes nodded. He saw the long game. He knew the dangers and the necessity of preserving what he had found. That letter proves it. I exhaled slowly. Then why keep it hidden? Because, Holmes said, folding the letter with great care, there are still players on the board, Watson. Norwood may have withdrawn, but those above him, the friends of the Crown, do not rest. To reveal this now would change nothing but invite further attempts to erase it. He placed the letter inside a fireproof box in the bureau and locked it. Let them sleep, he said. Let the truths wait for a time when men no longer fear them. I shook my head. And yet, Holmes, I can't help but wonder if we've lost something too, some small light, extinguished before its time. Holmes looked at me for a long moment. No, Watson, it flickers still. That evening, as we dined quietly and returned to our individual preoccupations, he with his violin, I with my pen, I reflected on the curious endurance of hidden things. The manuscript, the forgery, the buried letter. Truth, it seemed, had many disguises, but in the hands of men like Holmes, and yes, Sir Benedict, it had at least the chance to be remembered. A week later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It depicted a small plaque recently installed on the rear wall of St. Dunstan's Church in Clerkenwell. The inscription read, "Beneath this stone lies a man who sought truth in silence and left the rest to time. He disturbed the past not to shame it, but to illuminate it. No name, no date. But I knew I kept it in my journal between the pages of my own account of the case. And though that story may never be read in full, I will say this. There are cases that test the mind, others that test the soul, but some, the rarest, test both, and leave behind a silence more meaningful than any verdict. Spring came reluctantly to London that year, ushered in not by warmth, but by a thinning of the fog and a change in the smell of the river. By the time March gave way to April, Holmes and I had resumed something close to our usual pattern: consultations, monographs, the occasional case involving mislaid jewels or fraudulent financiers. Yet there remained a quiet current beneath our daily affairs, a residue of the deeper mystery that had occupied our winter months. The affair of Sir Benedict Wareham had passed, officially, without scandal. No arrests were contested, no newspapers dug deeper, and no historian publicly questioned the catalogued status of the manuscript housed in the British Museum. A silence had settled over the matter, one carefully constructed, as Holmes had predicted, by forces that preferred stability over disruption. But the truth, now preserved if not proclaimed, remained intact. And then one morning came the final note. I was at the breakfast table, immersed in a report from the Times on a continental banking scandal, when Holmes entered, uncharacteristically solemn. In his hand was a letter, already opened, the envelope creased from having been turned over more than once. "It's from Miss Wareham," he said quietly. I set the paper aside. "Bad news?" "No, but not simple either." He handed it to me. The letter was written in Miss Wareham's tidy, slanted hand, marked with the black border still appropriate to her mourning. "My dear Mr. Holmes, you will forgive the forwardness of this message, but I felt you should know what has transpired since we last spoke. I have made a decision that may alter the quiet course you so delicately arranged. I have taken steps to publish not the manuscript itself, but an academic commentary, anonymized, which frames the document's existence without assigning it a name or legacy. It will appear under the authorship of a consortium of historians, including those who have examined the original. I shall not claim credit, but I believe the truth must begin to breathe. I understand the risk. I understand, too, the necessity. You gave me time to choose, and I thank you for that. But I cannot ask future generations to bear the burden of silence I myself could not endure. Yours in lasting gratitude, Lillian Wareham." I read it again, then looked at Holmes. "She's brave." "She is," he replied, "and wise. She chose a middle path, truth not shouted but whispered. Enough for scholars to follow, not enough for the wolves to chase." "But will it be safe?" "As safe as anything can be," Holmes said. "There are still men who would suppress it, but without names, without provenance, there is little for them to strike against. The manuscript is no longer a single thread to be cut. It is a shadow on the wall, one that will eventually become a shape." He turned back toward the fireplace, where the morning fire had burned low. The grey daylight was soft on his features, and for a moment I thought I saw the lines of fatigue a little deeper than before. "You admire her," I said. Holmes did not answer at once. Then he said, "I admire conviction, Watson, especially when it is born not of stubbornness but of clarity. She understood the cost, and she paid it willingly." "And what now?" I asked. He stirred the fire absently. "Now we wait, we watch. History will do what it always does. It will absorb the truth, deny it, resist it, and eventually reshape itself around it. Whether in our lifetime or the next, someone will pick up the thread again." Later that day, we received an unannounced visit. It was Reverend Allerton, the ecclesiastical scholar, who had once served as Wareham's confidant. He looked older than when we had last seen him, less cloaked in mystery and more weary with age. He carried a small parcel in his gloved hands and declined tea with a gentle shake of the head. "I won't stay long," he said, "but I thought you should have this." He handed Holmes the parcel. Inside was a slim volume bound in green leather, a handwritten journal in Sir Benedict's hand. "He wrote it over the last 3 months of his life," Allerton said. "A private chronicle, thoughts on the manuscript, notes of paranoia, regrets, hopes. I found it tucked behind a false drawer in his personal library, which is only now being properly inventoried. I thought of sending it to Miss Wareham, but something told me you ought to read it first." Holmes bowed his head. "Thank you." Allerton lingered only a moment longer, then made his departure. We waited until the room was once more ours, then unwrapped the journal. Holmes opened it to the first page, where a single line was written. There are truths that live in the open, and truths that survive only in shadow. I have lived too long with both. The journal offered no revelations about hidden heirs or royal conspiracies. Instead, it was a man's quiet, desperate attempt to reconcile his discovery with the world around him. He wrote of sleepless nights, of moments where he nearly burned the document himself. He wrote of Lillian, of her curiosity and courage. And in one passage, written in an unsteady hand, he addressed a man by name. To you, Sherlock Holmes, if you ever read this, forgive me. I did not trust you with the truth while I lived, but I feared that your brilliance might bring the wrong conclusion. I see now that I was wrong. You saw what I could not, that silence is not always discretion, and that revelation is not always ruin. Should the truth survive me, let it be because someone smarter than I knew when to speak and when to wait. Holmes closed the book and set it gently on the desk. Was he right? I asked softly. About you? Holmes gave a thin, tired smile. No, but he was right about truth. It cannot be forced. It must arrive when the world is ready to hear it. In the weeks that followed, the publication of the anonymized commentary passed without public uproar. A few academic journals noted its peculiar phrasing. A handful of historians whispered that its conclusions hinted at something long buried. But no names were mentioned, no thrones toppled, just a quiet stirring, like the first breeze through a closed library window. And in our rooms at Baker Street, life resumed. Letters arrived, new cases formed. But beneath it all, there remained the memory of a grave behind St. Dunstan's, and a manuscript that once threatened to reshape a kingdom and instead reshaped the conscience of those who guarded it. On one such evening, as we sat reading by lamplight, Holmes turned to me and said, "You'll never publish this case, Watson." I looked at him. "Not now, perhaps not ever, but I'll write it. And I'll leave it behind for whoever dares to read it when the world is older." He gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then that will be enough." And I knew as I picked up my pen and turned to a fresh page in my journal that the final chapter had already been written, not in ink, but in the quiet decision to protect the truth and to release it, not with fanfare, but with care. For there are mysteries that solve crimes and those that illuminate history. This had been both. And as the fire burned low and the fog thickened once more outside our windows, Sherlock Holmes, the man who had outwitted kings and blackmailers and murderers, turned back to his violin and played a tune only the past could hear. The final weeks of that singular spring passed with an uncommon stillness in our lives. There were no further letters, no anonymous warnings, no secret visits cloaked in midnight fog. For the first time since the death of Sir Benedict Wareham, the matter lay as he had once buried the manuscript itself, undisturbed, half forgotten, and sheltered from the noise of the outside world. And yet, in true Holmesian fashion, the final stroke came not with a bang, but with the quietest of touches, a final thread woven back into place that revealed at last the full tapestry. It happened in early May when we received an invitation from the British Museum to attend a private viewing of a newly assembled exhibit, Testaments of the Past, Unpublished Echoes of the Middle Ages. The exhibit was to be academic in tone, deliberately sparse in detail, and intentionally misleading in its arrangement. No references to the Wareham manuscript, no mention of forgeries or hidden claims, just anonymous parchments, curated artifacts, and translations that whispered of controversies without daring to name them. Holmes accepted the invitation with little ceremony. "It will be instructive," he said, "to see what the world does with truth when it no longer fears it." We arrived that afternoon under grey skies. A light rain fell in rhythm against the museum's colonnades, and inside, the long gallery where the exhibit was housed was nearly empty. A few scholars milled about, murmuring in low Latin and hushed English. The central glass case held the manuscript, not the original, of course, but a facsimile rendered with careful fidelity. Beside it lay a printed plaque, Anonymous Codex, circa late 13th century. Language, Latin. Subject, ecclesiastical and dynastic confessions. Status, authenticated. Provenance under review. Interpretation ongoing. Holmes read it without emotion. I, on the other hand, felt a tremor of something deeper, pride, perhaps, mingled with melancholy. So much had been risked for these few lines of ink beneath glass. As we turned to leave, a familiar voice called softly from the far end of the gallery. "Mr. Holmes." Miss Wareham approached, dressed in muted colours, her expression composed but not without warmth. "You've seen it, then?" she said. Holmes inclined his head. "And you?" "I visit often," she said. "It helps, I think, to see it presented this way, divorced from names. It lets the facts breathe without yet demanding belief." "A clever compromise," Holmes said. "And the publication?" "It was well received. Cautious scholars are citing it. A few dismiss it as a literary curiosity. Others are beginning to connect the threads carefully." She paused, then added, "No one's been hurt?" "Yet." Holmes nodded once. "Then you've done more than Sir Benedict ever could. You've succeeded where he feared to begin." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But it was you who gave me the time and the safety to choose." Holmes's eyes met hers. "It is not often I place faith in others, Miss Wareham, but in this I did." There was silence for a moment, and then she said, "There's something I wanted to give you." She withdrew from her handbag a thin envelope and handed it to him. Holmes opened it and drew out a folded slip of parchment, aged, brittle, unmistakably original. Holmes's brow lifted. "An untranslated fragment," she said. "Found among Sir Benedict's private papers. We believe he tore it from the original codex before making the final copy. The scholars hadn't noticed. But I recognized the handwriting." Holmes read the lines in Latin, then smiled, not with triumph, but with something like peace. "What does it say?" I asked. He looked at me. "He who guards the truth must know when to hide it and when to let it speak." I exhaled. "So even in the margins?" I said. Sir Benedict left a clue. "Indeed," Holmes said. "A final testament, not of lineage or politics, but of judgment." He handed the fragment back to Miss Wareham, who replaced it carefully in her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," she said, "not just for solving the mystery, but for preserving the man behind it." When she was gone, Holmes turned to me. "The case is closed, Watson, entirely this time. Every truth accounted for, every lie neutralized. No further adversaries in the wings." He shook his head. "The adversaries are history, pride, and fear, but we've postponed their victory, for now." We walked in silence through the echoing halls of the museum and out into the rainy London street. The carriages rattled on, the fog gathered in familiar corners. Life, indifferent and eternal, resumed its course. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes played a slow, haunting air on his violin as I finished the final entry in my private account of the case. He had asked me not to publish it in my lifetime, and I agreed, not out of obedience, but because I, too, had come to understand the cost of truth unleashed too soon. And so the story remained with us, bound in my handwriting, resting in the drawer where I kept only the rarest and most personal of records. The case of the conspiracy of the Forgotten Testament had ended not with justice in court, nor with fanfare in the press, but with a choice made by those who valued knowledge and guarded it not for power, but for posterity. And that, I have always believed, is the truest kind of victory. For in the world of Sherlock Holmes, the greatest mysteries are not merely solved, they are understood, and sometimes, just sometimes, they are forgiven.